Are you a cave dweller? Do you like moss, mushrooms, and fungus? Well then this fight might be for you. Welcome to the normal and heroic Brackenspore raid guide. Alright, we'll start off talking about the 3 different adds you'll have to deal with throughout this encounter. The first add is going to be spore shooters. These will spawn, anywhere from 2 to 4 of them will spawn randomly around the room, depending on how big your raid is. What these will do is they'll cast and shoot out these projectiles, these spore projectiles, which will slowly move towards whoever it was targeted on. It will explode on the first person that it hits, which means that you can have people stand in front of them and tank these hits. And the reason for this is when it hits somebody, the spore hits somebody, it will explode and do AoE damage, a pretty significant amount of it. So you can either have your raid stack up and AoE heal through these spore damage, or you can have individuals stand out and soak this damage, which means they'll take the damage, but the rest of the raid won't, and you'll just need to make sure that you pump heals into those people that are soaking, so that they don't die. You want to kill the spore shooters pretty quickly. We just had our dot classes in ranged especially focus it down. Melee, we didn't bother sending them out to kill these at all. It's really not that worth it. If they spawn in or near melee, they can always swap and kill it just to bring it down quick, but for the most part that won't happen because they can spawn quite literally anywhere around the room, which can be quite annoying if they're really far ranged, and a lot of times you'll want your flamethrower team to handle them, but we'll get into that in a later section. Alright, next we'll talk about the mine fungus. Now this is a mushroom that'll spawn on a random raid member, and what this will do is pulsate around itself for, I believe it's 20 yards, and will slow casting speed quite significantly for all your caster DPS and all your healers. There's a lot of healing that needs to go out, and it's a pretty tight DPS fight, so you want to kill this mushroom really fast. If it does spawn on one of your flamethrower team members or on one of your DPS that are soaking spore shots, it's most likely not going to be affecting a lot of raid members, in which case it doesn't need to die immediately. You can just wear it down with dots. But for the most part, if you just use your head about where it is, you can judge whether or not it needs to be killed immediately, or if you can slowly wear it down. Alright, now we're going to talk about the flamethrowers. And these are 2 little guns that spawn on the floor, and you can pick them up before the fight starts. And basically, your raid is going to be using these, 2 of your raid members anyway, will be using these to run around the room and clear the moss that is spawning around the room on the edges and moving in towards the boss. This moss does pretty significant damage if anyone's standing in it, and it also slows. And most importantly, it will heal the boss if he's standing in it. So it's kind of like a soft and rage mechanic. If the moss is covering the whole room, the raid's gonna wipe because the boss will just be healing no matter where you go. Now, like I said, you get 2 guns, and that doesn't matter on what, how many people are in your raid. You always get 2 guns. I believe you get 3 in Mythic, but this is just normal and heroic, so we're not going to talk about Mythic. Now, you want classes that have high mobility and classes that can do damage really well on the move. Hunters are really good for this. That's what our raid uses, 2 hunters. Boomkins can be pretty good at this because they can just go in cat form and sprint around, and then they can dot up while their buff is ticking, so those dots are really strong. I know rogues can do decent at this because of the sprint and burst of speed. They're not going to be doing a whole lot of DPS while they're doing that, so it'd be a lower priority for me if you needed to use a rogue. We've had a mage do it before when nobody else was there, so you'll need to play around with it. It's basically, I would pick your players that are going to be the best at mechanics, because if nothing else, they need to clear the moss. Their damage is important, but you can kill this boss without them maximizing the buff. Though, to be fair, maximizing the buff and doing huge DPS is definitely fun. So, if you have any DPS whores in your raid, I would suggest letting them use this, because they will figure out how to use the buff perfectly. Speaking of which, it's going to take a few attempts for them to get used to it. It's kind of an odd mechanic. I don't think we've ever had anything like it before. I guess we've had similar mechanics like Ragnaros maybe, but it didn't have a damage buff. Anyway, back on track. So basically, yeah, you pick up these 2 guns at the beginning of the fight, and you get this your extra action button pop up, and that's going to activate and deactivate the flamethrower. And you'll also get this power bar, which is going to be, it's a heat for the gun. Now if you get to 100 heat and you overheat, the gun has to cool down before you can start using it again. And that's going to take, I believe it's 10 seconds, where it's stuck at 100 heat before it starts cooling down. So you never want to overheat, unless it's going to be the difference between a wipe and not. Like if you're rushing at the end. And you'll see in this kill video, I actually overheat a couple of times. I was still getting used to the gun myself. And the best way I found to use this is, you can start off the fight, and about maybe a minute in or so after the first infesting spores goes out, that's when you want to go out and start clearing. Because the best way to do it is you want to utilize every activation of the flamethrower. So every time you turn it on, you want to be able to clear as much moss as you possibly can before you turn it off. Because turning it on takes 10 heat, and then it just accumulates heat slowly over time as it's on. So the more buffs you can get, the better. Now you get 1 stack of buff for every patch of moss you clear, and you want to plan your path for clearing the moss so that you can clear as much of it without having to turn off the gun from being in the middle of nowhere with no moss, essentially. Now the way we assign the room is there's sort of a north half and a south half of the room, and we have one person focus on the north half and one person focus on the south half, and that's how we do most of the fight. Once we get to the end of the fight and it starts getting hectic and there's moss covering the whole room, we sort of just focus on clearing around the boss to make sure that it doesn't get near him and heal him, or any of the raid for that matter. Depending on what your DPS looks like, you might get to the point where the helpful mushrooms, which we'll talk about in a while, will spawn in moss, and depending on where it spawns, you'll need to use your own judgment to determine whether or not you can actually clear the moss around it so that it's safe enough for your raid to use it. If you can't use those mushrooms, then you'll need to make sure you have healing cooldowns to deal with the infesting spores. But like I said, it's just going to take a while for your flamethrower team to get used to this mechanic, but once they do, it'll be very fun for them. Alright, next we're going to talk about the 2 helpful mushrooms. So the first is going to be the green one. Now this one is going to heal your raid once you fully top it off, and the way this mushroom works is it's going to spawn with low health, and your healers are going to pour heals into it. And once it's fully healed, it'll emit a green circle, which will indicate it's activated, and then it's going to be healing your raid. So healers pour heals into it, and then it heals the raid in turn. And you're going to want to time this with the infesting spores. You're going to want to top it off when the infesting spores go out so that it's counteracting the huge raid-wide damage from that. Now, once it is fully topped off and it starts healing the raid, it's going to start taking damage. And this damage is going to ramp up over time to the point where it will just die, no matter what you do. So you'll need to pour more and more heals into it to keep it alive. Now, some healer cooldowns seem to work on it, some don't, so you need to experiment with whichever ones you have to keep it alive as long as possible, and to keep it healing the raid as long as possible. You'll want your flamethrower team to make sure that they clear around these green mushrooms, and later in the fight when there's moss covering most of the room, they'll need to focus on making sure that the moss isn't going to go into this green circle, because that damage is going to be hurt the raid and it's going to kill the mushroom even faster. Alright, next we'll talk about the blue mushroom, the other helpful mushroom. Now this one, my personal favorite, gives a huge haste buff and a mana regen buff, which is going to benefit your healers and all of your DPS greatly. Now this mushroom, unlike the green one, will spawn at or near a player in your raid. So you want to have the majority of your group stacked up, probably in the green mushroom because that one spawns first, and then the blue mushroom will spawn on top of that so that your raid can benefit from both mushrooms at the same time. If this is the case, you'll want to prioritize the blue mushroom over the green mushroom. Now, the blue mushroom works just like the green mushroom in that it starts at low health and your healers have to heal it up, and then once it's fully healed up, it'll start granting its haste buff and mana regen buff, and then it'll start slowly taking damage and dying, and your healers are going to want to pump heals into it to keep it up. Now, like I said, if the 2 shrooms are stacked together, the green mushroom will heal it, which will help keep it healed longer, so that your raid will have it up even more. Your flamethrower team will want to try to maximize this blue mushroom also. They want to try to get as many stacks as they can, and time it so that their cooldowns, their potion, and the blue mushroom are all going to be going at the same time, so that they can pour huge damage into either the boss or the ad, whichever is the current priority. And you want to keep that in mind as well. And just like the green mushroom, you can pop cooldowns on the blue mushroom to keep it alive as long as possible. You can also pop Lust again for the blue mushroom. I don't know that it actually does anything for the blue mushroom, but it does get the buff. So if you're bored, you can do that, I guess. That's a thing. Now, for the blue mushroom and the green mushroom, there are these big circles that spawn around them to indicate that they're activated, but the actual range for the buff is slightly larger than that green or blue circle, so you can be standing slightly out of it and still be getting the buff. I believe it's 20 yards is the actual buff range, and I believe the circles around them are 10 to 15 yards. But yeah, you want to make sure you're definitely getting the buff. And if you're not getting either of them, you'll notice because your DPS is really low or you're dying. So you can use those as indicators to figure out whether or not you have it. Alright, last but certainly not least is the fungal flesh eater. Now this is the big ad that'll spawn from the lake, and you want to have one of your tanks go over and pick it up and bring it into melee. Now, this ad is going to be casting Decay, and this is going to be a huge raid-wide damaging spell, so you want to make sure that it gets interrupted. We have 3 people in our guild assigned to interrupt it, 3-person rotation, and then all of our ranged and other melee just spam their interrupts to make sure that it does get interrupted. When the ad does first spawn and it's being dragged over to melee, it'll probably cast a Decay, possibly 2, depending on where Brackenspore is positioned and the ad spawns. So you want to make sure you have ranged DPS assigned to making sure it gets interrupted before it gets to the group, where the melee can focus on getting the interrupts. And yeah, you want to make sure all your DPS are focusing on killing this. They can cleave off onto the boss and multi-dot, but the ad needs to die. He'll be slowly accumulating stacks of Flesh Eater, and this is going to cause him to cast Decay faster and faster, and at around 7 or 8 stacks of this, it's going to be basically instant and uninterruptible. And if that happens, it will be a raid wipe. So you want to make sure all your DPS focus on that, especially your flamethrower team with that damage buff. If you have them plowing DPS into it, it'll die pretty quickly, and then it shouldn't be a problem. Now, the last thing we have to talk about is infesting spores. Now this is a debuff the boss will cast. It's a stacking debuff, which will do pretty significant damage to the entire raid. The way this debuff works is, as he's casting it, he'll apply stack after stack after stack, and every time he applies a stack, it will refresh the time. Which will make a total of something like 20 to 25 seconds on the debuff. And this is going to be huge damage. You're going to want to make sure that healers are timing the green mushroom with when the infesting spores goes out. This way that the raid is going to be getting huge heals. They also can use the blue mushroom. The blue mushroom with all the mana and the haste will also help greatly in healing through this if you're, for whatever reason, you don't have the green mushroom. Later in the fight, for example, if the green mushroom spawns in moss and you can't use it. You also want to have cooldowns for the end of the fight again to make sure that if your green mushroom does spawn in moss and you can't get to it, you want to have the cooldowns up for the infesting spores that you live through it. Now, for the flamethrower team, which we'll get to in a minute, that team will be... They're probably going to be out from the raid when the infesting spores goes out, but they'll need to be aware of when it's going to go out so that they can judge whether or not they need to pop personals, use their own self-healing, or run in for heals. They'll need to judge whether or not they can prioritize healing or clearing moss. With personals and self-healing, you can survive the infesting spores. You'll get pretty low, and you'll need to run in for heals at some point, but it'll be up to them to decide whether or not they can survive it and clear moss based on where they are in the fight. Alright, there are 2 main abilities the tanks will have to deal with throughout this fight. The first is Rot, which is simply a stacking debuff that does damage over time. The boss will apply this to his main target, and the tanks will just want to swap at about 4 stacks. The next is a frontal cone called Necrotic Breath, which will do significant damage and also reduce the healing taken by that person being hit while the Necrotic Breath is going. Because of this, you'll want to make sure that only one tank is being hit by this at a time. So when there's only the boss up, just have the other tank behind the boss with the melee until he needs to swap. And when there's an ad up, he'll just need to position himself so that the raid can cleave the ad and the boss, but that he's not being hit by the Necrotic Breath with the other tank. On that note, when the fungal flesh eater is up, you want to make sure that one tank is taking the boss and one tank is taking the ad. And then when you need to reset the rot stacks, you swap what you're tanking. You don't want to have one tank taking both the ad and the boss. Also, for the Necrotic Breath, you also want to be aware that the damage range is well beyond where the animation is, and the flamethrower team will possibly be hit by this. They'll want to be aware of their positioning with the boss so that they can avoid taking the damage. If they do, just make sure they pop a personal or that they come into the group for healing at some point. It won't kill them, but it'll do a good amount of damage that they'll need to be healed up before something else goes out, like a spore shooter hits them or necrotic spores goes out to kill them. Positioning for this fight will be an active thing. You'll want to essentially move the boss wherever there is a green mushroom. You want the whole raid to stack inside the green mushroom, which will cause the blue mushroom to spawn inside of that. This way you'll pretty much always have the green mushroom with the blue mushroom, and you'll be able to utilize both buffs. You want to make sure your tank is close enough to get the buffs too, without actually getting anybody hit with the necrotic breath or anything like that, which is easily doable. The mushrooms have a pretty wide range. if for whatever reason the mushrooms are messed up and you can't get both of them, you want to prioritize the blue mushroom. It's going to be better for the raid in general because the mana regen and the haste will help you actually kill the boss. It's actually a pretty tight DPS race depending on your gear. When we first killed this, it was very close. The other thing you need to worry about is the actual moss. If it hits the boss, it'll heal him. So the tanks will need to pay attention to where the moss is and make sure the boss doesn't get hit by it, and call for your flamethrower team to go over and clear it. Later in the fight, once most of the room is covered in moss, if you get to that point, you'll need to use your own judgment to determine whether or not you can use a particular mushroom as it spawns. Since green mushrooms can spawn anywhere, there's a pretty good chance at the end of the fight that it'll spawn completely surrounded by moss, and your flamethrower team will probably be close to overheating and they won't be able to effectively clear all the moss so that you can utilize it, in which case you'll just need to position the boss in such a way that everyone is stacked. Essentially, there's no specific spot to go to other than in a spot where he won't be hit by moss. Okay, so this fight is really all about mechanics. Once you get them all down, you should easily be able to take the boss down without much trouble. So the first thing you want to do is you want to pull the boss and bring him right to the first green mushroom that spawns and have your whole raid stack up. And once they do this, the blue mushroom should spawn shortly after right on the raid so that you can utilize both buffs. When spore shooters spawn, make sure your ranged DPS kill them, and when the mind fungus spawns, also make sure it's killed. Most often it'll be within the raid, so your melee can switch and kill it, and this will be beneficial because the mind fungus does the pulsating AoE that'll slow your casters, which will make it take longer for them to kill it, so you'll want to make sure melee is able to switch to it. Once the fungal flesh eater spawns, make sure it's interrupted on its way to the group, and then make sure your melee have a set rotation on interrupting the decay so that it doesn't wipe your raid. Make sure you tank the ad and the boss together so that they can be cleaved down, and you want to focus the ad down and kill it quick before it gets too many stacks to the point where you can no longer interrupt the decay. Your flame shooters, you need to make sure that they are being on top of moss and that they're clearing everything as efficiently as possible and utilizing their buff as best as they can. Assign one person to the north and one person to the south half, and it'll take some practice for them to get used to using the gun themselves, but once they do, they'll be able to clear it without much of a trouble. The best way to do this, I found, is to wait till after the first infesting spores, and then you can start clearing moss, because before that there isn't quite enough moss yet on the map for it to be efficient to do so, and it's kind of just a waste, and you can't really utilize the buff. If possible, you'll want to get as many stacks of the buff as you can while you have cooldowns up. Time it so that you can use your cooldowns with a bunch of stacks and a blue mushroom if possible. And that's pretty much this fight. It's just a rinse and repeat fight. It's a DPS check in the sense that you need to kill it before the raid is covered in moss, and the better your flame shooter team is, the more time you'll have with this too. So yeah, good luck and have fun.